Okay, moving along in Steiner's Egyptian Myths and Mysteries to lecture number 9 of 12. We're coming up onto the tail end of his lectures here. And we saw last time how Steiner had shown us the evolution of the human spirit through these early zodiacal phases that have moved up toward the gradual extraction of the human from the animal. And in this lecture, he sort of picks up where he leaves off, and he says what he focuses on here is how the outer world is gradually perceived by these beings from the Lemurian epoch all the way down to the time of the Christ event in the middle of the Greco-Latin period, and how the human being has perceived the outer world and how it has come into sharper and sharper and sharper focus with the development of object consciousness and the sense of true subjectivity, so that there's a very strong subject-to-object distinction that the West inherits in its philosophy with the Cartesian cogito and Heidegger's understanding of Vorhandenheit, where we have an absolute subject beholding absolute objects that exist in de-worlded vectorial phase space, Cartesian axes, x, y, z in vectorial phase space. So he's discussing this, and he's talking about the Lemurian phase, and he says, imagine that we could go back to the Lemurian phase. And he says that before that we had been talking about these creatures swimming around in the water, and the only organ that they had to perceive things was the pineal gland, which sort of lit their way for them, but they could only see through a spiritual clairvoyant consciousness. They couldn't yet see the physical plane until the gradual solidification of the physical body led to the creation of eyes with which to perceive the outer world. And this took place very early on, but these eyes could only see things in a very dim, murky way, as in Lemurian times, which is the epoch that takes place before the Atlantean period. So we have this Lemurian epoch, which is the time when the moon withdrew from the earth, and the outer world would have taken on a very dim, foggy sort of look, like looking at a street lamp through fog. And then the sleeping-waking cycle, once it came into being, created an oscillation in these beings, moving into the Atlantean period as well, created an oscillation in these beings whereby at night they left their physical bodies, their astral bodies and their egos left the physical bodies and communed clearly in the realm of the gods, with the gods. And then the daytime they returned into their physical bodies, but things looked murky when they looked out on the world. And he says that imagine that during this Lemurian period, you're an individual and you go to sleep at night when the full moon is out. There has to be a full moon, he says, for the full impact of the Osirian experience. Since Osiris is identified now with the moon, he's one of the gods on the moon, along with, as it will later turn out, Yahweh. So he's one of the gods on the moon. And he says that the astral body then can look down at the physical body that's lying there asleep in bed with the etheric body within it, repairing the damages that have been inflicted during the day on the physical body by the excesses of the astral body. And he says that the astral body then could sort of hover above the physical body and stream down spiritual influences on the physical body to make it stronger. And the astral body in turn would be receiving a stream of spiritual energy from Osiris, from the full moon, and the full impact of the Osirian experience would rain and stream down the spiritual energy into the astral body, which could then in turn stream it down to the physical body, thereby making it stronger. So this was the consciousness that Lemurian man had in the waking-sleeping cycle over time, but gradually over time the spiritual world darkened for him. He became less and less clairvoyant, and during Atlantean times the physical world slowly began to take on more and more clarity, until by the end of the Atlantean period, with the Atlantean catastrophe, we had individuals who had lost most of their clairvoyant consciousness and could really only inhabit their bodies in the daytime and see a much clearer, more objectified physical world, and their nighttime experience was getting murkier and murkier, as it has become for us, where it's almost totally murky and we can barely remember our dreams when we wake up. So he says that was the experience during Atlantean times and Lemurian times, and now for the rest of the lecture he begins to sort of recap certain points he's already made, but then he amplifies them a bit about the Post-Atlantean epochs, of which, as we have seen, that there are 7 of them, pushing it all the way back to 7000 BC with what he calls the ancient Indian civilization, and which lasts for 2,000 years, 7,000 to 5,000. And he does this because he, as we've said, he wants these epochs to correspond to the precession of the equinoxes. This would have been in the sign of the crab, At this time, 5000 BC, the precession would have moved. The second Post-Atlantean civilization would come into being with the ancient Persian, which would correspond to the dualism of the Gemini. Then the third Post-Atlantean civilization with the Egypto-Babylonian Chaldean civilization, which would then correspond with the next sign as we move from Cancer to Gemini and to Taurus, with all the bull symbolism in ancient Egypt. And then with about the time of Homer, we get the shift into Aries, the age of the ram, and all the goat and ram sacrifices and symbolism that attend the Greco-Latin civilization, during the middle of which the Christ event comes down and transfigures it and begins to shift it into the precession into Pisces. And the period of the precession through the first fish, the vertical fish, lasts all the way down to about 1400 AD, when our civilization, which brings into being the consciousness soul, then comes into being with the precession into the second fish, the horizontal fish, which Young points out in his book Ion, symbolizes the shift from an axial orientation, a spiritual axial orientation in the Christian medieval epoch, to a horizontal orientation with mastery over the physical plane that occurs in the Faustian epoch, or the far western, the age of the far western civilization, in which we are still to go down to about 3500 AD now for Steiner, whereupon the shift into Aquarius will have taken place. And then he doesn't say this, but the sixth and seventh civilizations still to come would then, of course, correspond to the remaining two signs of the zodiac, the precession into Capricorn for 6 and the precession into Sagittarius for the 7th. So he wants it to come out that way, so that everything corresponds to his model of the precession of the equinoxes. And then, so he says the rishis now, in the first of these post-Atlantean civilizations, would have still had a kind of dim memory of this being on the other side with the gods during sleep, and they sort of developed a nostalgia for that, a yearning for that kind of spiritual consciousness. And so the 7 rishis that Manu taught in turn taught their pupils, and this nostalgia for the spiritual plane caused them to regard the physical world as an illusion, as Maya. It wasn't real, and it caused their religiosity then to focus on a type of religiosity that was based on denying the physicality of the world and the body, and saying that it's all an illusion of the senses. And so in a way, in a very solid way, for the ancient Indians, the world was, there was nothing concrete about it. So the physical world was not real for them. But he says this wasn't the case for the second of the post-Atlantean civilizations, the Persians, who come into being around 5000 BC. We get the shift into Gemini and the dualism of Zoroastrianism, where the physical world becomes more real now. It's a real thing, but it's governed by Ahriman, the god of matter, who has created it in opposition to Ahura Mazda's realm of pure light. And we need to work then in this religion on the physical world through good deeds, good works, agriculture, performing your duties, working on the physical world, because there was a fundamental fall of the world of darkness from the world of light. This is the earliest myth that we have for the origins of the fall. We're working toward a restoration. At the end of history, which is a 12,000 year cycle divided into 4 epochs of 3,000 years each, there will come a restoration, and we will return to the realm of the light. And so for the Persian world, the physical world is taking on a solidity. It's becoming more real as our objective consciousness looks out on the world, and it begins to come into sharper and sharper definition. He says then for the third post-Atlantean epoch, this is the Egypto-Babylonian Chaldean epoch, and really the Chaldeans are just a very late, sort of dead, dying echo of the great Mesopotamian civilization, in which he says that the physical world was very much more real for these two civilizations than it was previously. The Chaldeans, he says, saw in the stars, not Maya, but the handwriting of the gods and the signatures of all things, to use the term of Jakob Burma, the mystic, the signatures of all things left by the stars on the physical world, which was a real thing for them. And he says for the Egyptians too, they began to bring in highly developed sciences, geometry, mathematics, and a mastery over the physical plane that enabled them to create temples and pyramids. And for the first time, he says, very concrete statues begin to come into being, and the whole world for the Egyptian was really a physical thing that they sort of transubstantiated with their spiritual sciences to create mummies. They had a very strong grasp of the physical world as far as Steiner is concerned. And then we get to the fourth of these epochs, the one that's at the nadir, the one that is the furthest removed from an understanding of the spiritual world or from clairvoyant abilities in contact with the spiritual world. And we get the Greco-Latin civilization, whereby with the Greeks, we get their temples. And the Greek temple, he says, is something mightily physical, but it's almost as though the Greek could perceive the relation clairvoyantly between vertical and horizontal lines in space and simply filled them in with these columns, with the material aspect of these columns, with stone holding up the roof, the heavy architrave. And he said they built their temples for the gods. He said that the gods at this point could only incarnate as far down as an etheric body. So the gods did not have physical bodies, but the Greeks built physical bodies for their gods with their amazing statues in these temples, such as in the Parthenon, the statue of Athena Parthenos, which was 38 feet tall and carved out of gold and ivory by the sculptor named Phidias, about 438 BC. And within this statue, Athena would have been able to descend down and have a physical body. The etheric bodies of the gods were able to descend into these statues and experience having a physical body. And he says there's something totally complete and self-contained about these Greek temples, such that there doesn't need to be anyone in them for them to be complete. The gods are in them, and they're mostly exterior anyway. They're mostly colonnades. Whereas he says that for a Gothic cathedral, on the other hand, a Gothic cathedral isn't really finished without a congregation inside of it. That you have to have the faithful, as the word Dom, which is German for cathedral, indicates in the phrase Christendom. The Dom is not complete without the Christen, without the faithful, without the congregation being in there, and the rays of light coming in through the stained glass window that get divided up, just as the Spirit gets divided up out amongst the faithful, amongst the congregation, so that an empty cathedral is incomplete in a way that the Greek temple is not. It requires the faithful. But then he says that the Romans then take this descent into the physical as far as it could go, or as far as it did go at that point. It could have gone farther, he said, but at that point, and they developed their concept of individuality in a much stronger way. The Greeks had felt themselves as subjects and created statues of themselves as subjectivities in space, but they still felt themselves really as members of a polis. They were still citizens of particular city-states where they felt, I am a Spartan, or I am an Athenian, and they took great pride in that. So there's still not a fully developed subjectivity amongst the Greeks, the way there is, he says, amongst the Romans, who are the first to develop, and of course the Romans had very much more concrete practical engineering achievements. Indeed, we associate them not for spiritual and cultural achievements, but with engineering achievements. But they also developed a stronger sense of the self in the development of jurisprudence. They were the first to really work out law and to develop it, and to develop the sense of the last will and testament, whereby the individual can actually will things to happen even from beyond the grave. So there's a very much stronger sense of individuality amongst the Romans than the Romans were citizens, individual citizens, in a way that is very sharply demarcated from the Greek sense of the individual as a member of a polis, of a city-state. And so he says that this was as far removed from the spiritual world as we got, and we could have kept falling. He says we could have kept going further and further away from it, had it not been for the Christ event, in which the incarnation of Christ came down from the sun and began to turn things around for us at the ultimate nadir. Let's say when it's darkest before the dawn, as the cliche goes, and this was as far removed as humanity has come so far from the spiritual world. And had it not been for the Christ event coming down to turn things around for us, to begin to clear a path for us as we ascend up through these other three civilizations, our civilization, which clears a way back to us climbing back up toward the spiritual realm, but with new faculties intact. Of course, Steiner's model will say that the ego has to remain as part of this, as something that is intact with its critical faculties, unlike this New Age idea that having an intellect is a liability. It's just something that gets in the way, like with Eckhart Tolle and that kind of garbage, where the ego and the intellect is just something that gets in the way of your truly being here now. Steiner wouldn't have any truck with anything like that. So for Steiner, the intellect is absolutely essential. The ego is absolutely essential. These are hard-won faculties that have been built up slowly. Our sense of individuality and freedom of the will, all these faculties are absolutely part of the spiritual evolution of the human being, to take them back up as we ascend through the 5th, 6th, and 7th Post-Atlantean cultural epochs back up to the spirit world, which will have been completed, I think, by the time of the 6th epoch, which he says will correspond to the Russian epoch, and I suppose to the sign of Capricorn in some way, and another American epoch at the 7th, which will correspond somehow to the sign of Sagittarius. So this is him recapping his whole model and showing us where we're at. And so that's chapter number 9. And so we'll resume next with lecture number 10, and then we'll conclude with, there's only 12 lectures in this particular cycle, so we're nearing the completion of this.